Hey guys, what's up and welcome back to my channel. So today we're going to do something a little bit different and talk about the concept of purity balls. Now, before we get into the topic, I'm going to define what a purity ball is. And when I decided that I wanted to make this video, I also want to make it very clear that as much as a lot of religious rituals or religious traditions make me uncomfortable, the way I'm going into this is in a non-judgmental light. So going into this, I didn't decide this is weird, creepy, whatever. I didn't decide this is great, fantastic, I totally back it. So the way we're going to go into this is just to discuss it, and that's it. Not even necessarily to draw conclusions. Obviously you can draw your own, but that wasn't the purpose. I just kind of wanted to discuss it because it is interesting. I watched a short documentary about it, which I'll link down below, where you kind of follow the story of a young woman, or rather I should say a girl, who decides to take part in this. So you see it from the inside, and then I also read an article where a photographer takes photos of people who are going to purity balls, and they're very much an outsider. So I saw two pretty contrasting perspectives, and I'll link both down below. So from the article of that photographer who kind of went in taking pictures without knowing much, for those unfamiliar with the ritual, a purity ball is a religious ceremony in which fathers and daughters dress up in ball gown attire, spend a night of dinner and dancing together, and end the evening with a vow to abstain from sex until marriage. As photographer David Magnuson explains in Purity, a photography book on the subject, the girls make a pledge to remain pure and live pure lives before God, to stay sexually abstinent until marriage. Their fathers sign a commitment undertaking to protect their daughter's purity. So when I first read this, I had two pretty contrasting thoughts. One of the thoughts was, if a girl who is of age enough to understand what sex is and like what it entails, etc., or a young woman or a woman even decides they want to do that, I have no problem with it. It's their body, their choice, none of my business. On the other side though, I was also like, how much of this is personal choice versus indoctrination potentially for certain people, depending on what kind of family you're raised, so on and so forth. And also, how much of this is shame-based? The concept of purity is already interesting because the concept that if you have relations with someone, you're suddenly impure doesn't really sit that well with me. Then again, I was raised in the Catholic Church, so I was pretty close to that kind of ideology. And at a certain point, I really did believe that because it was indoctrinated when I was young enough to really believe it. But on the other hand, it's also like, if we respect a young woman for making the choice that she doesn't want to have sex until marriage, and that's fine, I don't think it should be fair to say, oh yeah, you're impure because you made your own choice. Because at the end of the day, it's about having your ownership over your own body. Obviously, I don't think this should pertain to young girls. I think it should be people who are in their teens who have some grasp and some understanding on what they're signing up for and what they're deciding to abstain from. So continuing with the article, then I'm going to talk about the documentary. Magnuson has been fascinated by this traditional rite so much that he embarked on his photographic endeavor to document the fathers and daughters who together take the vow. Of course, there's a lot to take issue with regarding concepts that govern a purity ball. As Flavorwire's Tom Hawking put it, it's hard to know where to start with this one. The notion of sex as impurity, the fact that it's all daughters and no sons, the idea of dressing a preteen girl in something that looks awfully like a wedding dress. When we teach girls that their virginity makes them special and valuable, we're sending the simultaneous message that without their virginity, they're tainted and damaged, The Guardian's Jessica Valenti wrote. And this is a quote from the photographer Magnuson, who says, "But as I learned more, I understood that the fathers, like all parents, simply wanted to protect the ones that they love in the best way they know how. It was also often the girls themselves that had taken the initiative to attend the balls. They had made their decisions out of their own conviction and faith, in many cases with fathers who didn't know what a purity ball was before being invited by their daughters." So again, if it is an autonomous choice, not one that's forced upon you, that you're pressured into, there's no issue in my perspective because, like I said, it's their body. They should have reign over that. Then again, I'm going to put a couple of pictures from the photography book on the screen, and you'll notice that in certain of the pictures, the daughters don't only look like young teenagers, they look like straight up children. That I take issue with simply because, first of all, there's no way they understand what sex is. There's no way that they're informed on what sex is in the sense of, like, when I was in Catholic school, they'd tell us, oh yeah, the way to not get pregnant and not get STDs is abstinence, which is just an extreme oversimplification when in reality, I think they should just give you the information you need so you can make your own responsible choices and be safe. And I feel like here it's similar in the sense of if you have young girls and you're taking them to this purity ball and they're committing to not have sex until marriage when they're like 10, I just don't think that is fair because they don't understand what they're signing up for. And it's hard for me to believe that they came to their father saying, hey, this is a cool thing to do. And even if they did, a father shouldn't necessarily second that immediately without explaining what the case is. And again, when you're too young for that, maybe it's just a question of letting them wait until they're old enough to have a better understanding of what they would be taking an oath for. So Magnuson, the photographer, ended up being pretty much pro this ceremony, tradition, whatever you want to call it. When I watched the documentary, I tried to go in with as fresh of a slate as possible. But again, there is an inherent bias because I was raised as Catholic. So a lot of these things are reminiscent to certain experiences in my life. In this documentary, there are some very, to me, disconcerting aspects. That's not to say that it's all entirely disconcerting. It's not a judgment. There are just some aspects that made me feel uncomfortable, such as there are certain parts, and I can't put them in because I'll be copyrighted, but there are certain parts where the girl we're following, Hannah, she mentions how she chose to make this oath and that because she's made this oath, she doesn't even want to be alone in a room with a man who's not a relative because that can lead to impure thoughts or impure actions. And while I completely respect the dedication, it's also like, I think it can also create a very unhealthy relationship with the opposite gender, assuming you're straight, which obviously here homosexuality is an issue, which we'll get to, or anything that's not heterosexuality really. But here, when we're talking about specifically heterosexual men and women, I don't think it's necessarily healthy to not be able to be in a room alone with them because you're afraid that something's going to happen. Because first of all, I think that minimizes your self-control because realistically, if you don't want anything to happen, nothing's going to happen unless one of the people assaults you, obviously. But if both of you are respectful individuals and neither of you want anything to happen, there's no reason that something will. And aside from that, I also don't think it's necessarily healthy to charge friendships between two opposite genders as automatically sexual. Like, it doesn't mean just because you're in a room alone with a man or you're in a room alone with a woman that something's gonna occur. Like, there is such a thing as platonic friendship. There is such a thing as like brotherhood or sisterhood, no matter what your gender is. So I think that's unhealthy because there's an automatic implication of man plus woman, it must equal sex, must equal immoral or impure thoughts, which I don't think is healthy just because like even in the workplace or in your general life, it's gonna end up being really harmful in the sense of you might lose friendships, you might lose job opportunities. There's so many things that might occur as a result of this preconceived notion that I don't think is accurate. Another thing that made me uncomfortable in that particular documentary I watched was that there's a woman who was essentially running and organizing the purity ball who was saying that when she was younger she got an STD and from there she kind of woke up. And a lot of older people had a similar story where when they were younger they had sex and maybe they weren't as informed as they should have been and they ended up getting STD, and because of that they took a vow of abstinence, which I think if we look at the core issue, it's like if you got an STD you may not have known how those are contracted, how to avoid getting them, or how to take care of them if you do subsequently get one. So I think the core issue isn't just like abstinence, that's it, end of conversation. I think a core issue should also be like, let's talk about how STDs are contracted, let's talk about sex, let's talk about sexual health, and then from there, if a young girl decides she wants to be abstinent, that's entirely fine, but give her all the information she needs before it's just this scary kind of like, if you sleep with someone, you're gonna get this like disease, which is, again, not accurate, and I think it's also a scare tactic. Last of all, in the documentary, they didn't really address where boys/young men fall in all of this. There was no real addressing of like, are boys/men expected to take this similar vow? Do they have a thing? Is it just assumed? You know, like, it's very interesting how the genders are treated differently there. And the other interesting thing was also that mothers are allegedly, according to that documentary, not allowed to go to the purity ball, which I thought was also strange because the implication just doesn't make me feel super comfortable, along with the dress looking kind of like a wedding dress. And they did say this isn't a mock wedding, that's what the organizer said, but then the father of the girl we're following kind of implied it was, so I was like, okay, well, which one is it? And if it is a mock wedding, then I have so many more issues, specifically because, like I said, in the photography book, there were very young girls, and I just don't feel comfortable about that. Last of all, the father of the girl we're following, Hannah, ended up saying that she might be made fun of or that people are gonna judge her, which, to be fair, yeah, that's probably gonna happen, but at the same time, at the beginning of the documentary, they do mention that being a homosexual is a sin. It's not surprising because there are certain categories of Christians who believe that. But again, it's also the hypocrisy of saying, oh yeah, you're going to be judged for making this choice, but we're going to judge people for what they are and have no control over. And the fact that there's no addressing the fact that some women who are Christian or are some similar denomination are going to inevitably be not heterosexual is also harmful, because they are really pushing the narrative of like, it's always man and woman, it has to be man and woman, and anything else is immoral, which goes also back to the fact that purity is so centered on whether you've had relations with someone, which in and of itself is, in my opinion, a flawed argument. The last thing I'm going to mention, and this one was slightly funny to me because it seemed so out there. The organizer of the purity ball said that if you're a single woman and you're kissing a single man, unless you're gonna marry him, you could technically be kissing someone else's husband, because they might end up marrying someone else, and therefore you just kiss someone else's husband even though they're not married yet or they've not even met. Which I thought was so surreal, because I was like, well, what if you kiss someone, you end up marrying them, and then you divorce? Then what does that mean? You know, like it's just very much a lot of mental gymnastics for things that may or may not occur. If we really go down that trajectory, we can come up with a million different outcomes that we have no guarantee on.
So one last point that I actually forgot to mention in the midst of all of these points is that at the end of the documentary, essentially once the ceremony is over, the fathers are given this key that they're then going to give to the husband of their daughters. And that creeped me out because it really does symbolize a kind of ownership over your own daughter's virginity, essentially, because that's what the whole ceremony is about. And I thought that was creepy, because if you're going to let your daughter make this autonomous decision, I don't think you should hold the key to then decide to give to the husband to kind of be like, go ahead, you know, now that it's fine and you're married, I'm allowing you to have relations with my daughter, which takes away any type of autonomy within the daughter. So that was interesting.
At the end of the day, I don't think it's inherently hurtful in the sense of, for the people who actually decide autonomously that they want to do that, no problem. Like I said, if they're of age that they can understand what they're signing up for and no one's pressuring them or making them feel a certain type of way if they don't do it, there's no issue with that. But I think the issue is how the argument is brought up, and then also how you're made to feel if you were to turn down taking that oath. You know, like if people are shamed when they turn down taking that oath, effectively what you're doing is pressuring them to take it, in which case it's less easy for me to believe that they genuinely want to do it, but rather they don't want to be seen negatively by their community. I can see both sides of it, and like I said, I don't think it's inherently A or B, it's just a case-by-case situation, but I do think that there are a lot of things wrong with it in the sense of, you know, the assumption that everyone's heterosexual, the lack of discussion over sexual health and how sex works generally in terms of avoiding diseases, and then aside from that, even just the gender differences between what men are expected to do, which isn't really gone into, versus expecting young girls / women to take this oath. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you to my patrons as always. Let's get